contribution of MSMEs has been central to India's growth. The micro, small, and medium enterprises sector is a key pillar of the Indian economy, and over 63 million units contribute significantly to growth and employment. However, about 99% of MSMEs in India are micro enterprises, and they remain micro throughout their life cycle. Low productivity, lack of efficiency, and limited means plague these units. As MSMEs fail to grow in size and scale, most lack the competitiveness when compared with global peers. What is needed to help our MSMEs scale and move up the value chain? How can India build globally competitive MSMEs? To discuss this and more, this webinar, which is a part of the ETRiseTop Top MSMEs 2021 rankings, we have with us today Animesh Saxena, President, Federation of Indian Micro and Medium Enterprises, FISME, Dr. Ajay Sahai, DG and CEO, Federation of Indian Export Organizations, Jiten Arora, Venture Lead Solv and member, SC Ventures, Standard Chartered Bank, and Pranav Kohli, Vice President, Stag International. Thank you all for joining us. My first question to you, Saxena. According to you, what is the MSME sector from being globally competitive? I know this is a little, open-ended question, but if you have to, talk about the top points.
The top points, I'll say the quality standards and its consistency. That's the biggest issue which Indian MSMEs are facing. And that is probably the primary most reason for not getting the opportunity to be part of the global value chain. And second is access to the new technology. And third, if I go for the training and skilling of the manpower. And all these put together, poor efficiency. So we are not globally competitive in terms of the pricing also, the output. So these four are the major factors which are pulling us behind and not getting us in the global value chain, part of the global value chain.
Right. Mr. Sahai, if I can come to you, you work closely with, export companies or firms which are in the export domain. What are some of the roadblocks that you think Indian firms face when it comes to global competitiveness?
I think the basic reason when we are talking about the competitiveness has to be seen both reference to the prices and quality. It is not that the price is the sole determinant. Whenever you are looking into the prices, you have to compare the equally quality goods also. As told by Mr. Animesh, it's a fact that we are lacking seriously so far as the quality of the product is concerned. And for the SMEs, probably the consistency of the product is equally important. Since we have not gone for a standardization of the product, we hardly have standards for many of the products. We have not applied them on the domestic industries also. We are seriously lacking it. Added to that is the challenges which SMEs in particular face on the supply side. And with that result, at times they are not able to supply the product in time. We should be now very well know that just in time is becoming the order. Companies are having very lean inventory, and that's why if the delay happens, that costs a lot to the SMEs. But at the same time, I think Indian SMEs, they have the advantage also being very flexible in operation. Their operational cost is one of the minimal in the world. And when you look into Indian SMEs and we look into some of the products where we are having very low level of operation, still we are getting a lot of business. Just to illustrate the point, if you are talking about Indian apparel sector's export to EU, we are doing very well as compared to some of our competing countries in Southeast Asia or South Asia, simply because of the fact that they are ordering low volume but high quality products, where India is score over many of these competing countries. Though, of course, when it comes to the assembly line, in apparel, we are lagging behind that. So I think we need to look into leverage it. You have rightly put it that when I'm talking about the SMEs, most of them are the micro one. There are very few small and the medium one. And when we compare them, though, of course, now with the new definition of MSME, they are little comparable with the Western SMEs also. But a few years back, they were not comparable also to them. So these are the challenges which they are facing it. But I think of late, we have seen that many of the small and medium companies, they have attracted huge investment and joint venture opportunity. I know many of the companies, even in the hinterland of UP and Punjab, where Chinese companies have come forward, invested in them, particularly at a time when the global tariff war was happening, and China thought that US market was lost to them. So they quickly moved to India. Now they're catching to the US market from Indian soil. And I think that's a good thing which has helped India also to push its exports in last few months.
Right. Jiten, if I can come to you, Mr. Arora, we've all talked about this, and the economic survey, I think, years ago came out and devoted an entire chapter, in fact, on this, that, Indian firms tend to start small, stay small, and what the survey said, as dwarfs. Okay? Why is this happening, and how is this impacting our competitiveness?
Yeah, Pran, that's a very good question. And I think Mr. Sahai had alluded to some of this. So I'll probably take a leaf out of that and probably expand on it. So the Indian micro SMEs contribution to GDP is roughly around 28 to 30%, which if you compare to the other developing or developed countries is at the lower end of the scale, although they do generate significant employment. But if you look at how they have grown, there is this concept of missing middle, which is also called as dwarf, with the Indian micro SMEs. Now, primary reason for that, I would say, are a couple. So one, lack of trusted ecosystems. Typically, micro SMEs, because they really don't have a huge amount of identity around themselves or worthiness, a great worthiness, they remain to be, they operate within their own ecosystems, whether that's the geographic vicinity or the first level connections that they have. For any micro SME to expand, they need to have an expanded ecosystem to deal with. So they should be able to get an access into more set of buyers and suppliers. The second is lack of timely working capital and growth capital. Now we know that India has a close to 300 billion funding gap when it comes to micro SMEs. Now, you can say that that's because of the creditworthiness of the micro SMEs. I also think it's because of the availability of digital data around them. So getting financial inclusion of the micro SMEs is very important to close this funding gap. And for that, a lot of the banks, NBFCs, financial institutions need to come up and look at their underwriting standards and modify them to be able to actually adapt better for the micro SMEs to a large extent. So it is a vicious circle. Because if you look at the SMEs or the micro SMEs, they're generally sole proprietorships in India. So typically they don't have the economies of scale, and typically they're focused on making sure they can keep their own business afloat rather than spend time in actually growing their ecosystem or making themselves creditworthy. So you got to break out of that vicious circle. But I'm happy to report that actually we have seen some of the changes set afoot with change of policy, encouraging participation of micro SMEs in the digital arena or economy, enabling them with timely required resources, as well as making sure that, and in fact, COVID has helped because it has brought a lot of receptivity to digital adoption. Finally, I think some of the policy changes around GST, income tax returns has helped because that creates a lot more about data, which makes the micro SMEs creditworthy, which gets them access to financing. And finally, the entrepreneurial spirit that keeps flying high in India. I think there's a huge opportunity here if we can actually put the right kind of rails of progress in place for the micro SMEs, for them to actually fix this missing middle, and to Mr. Sahai and Mr. Saxena's point, make the micro SMEs actually grow up to become the SMEs of the future.
All right. So I'll come to you, Pranav, now. While we know you have a fascinating story of how you grew the company. We'll get to that in a minute. But if you have to state some of the problems that you face, as an organization, what would that be? And what is stopping you from becoming more competitive? What are some of the things that you want the government to help you with?
I mean, I think I'll just quickly touch upon the points that Mr. Saxena mentioned and Mr. Sahai and also Mr. Arora mentioned. I think one of the things that Mr. Sahai mentioned about efficiency and quality, and these are prime concerns when you look at international buyers and when you look at people that we're dealing with. And then again, Mr. Sahai mentioned about global standards and not being up to the global standards, or not having the requisite certifications in place. And then Mr. Arora touched about the ecosystem. I think combine all these things. These are these are few things which, I believe personally that there is a big thought process change which is required. One, if I talk about the ecosystem, what happens is that micro SMEs tend to operate within their niche, and there's a lot to do with that, primarily because of the fact that we have always been labor intensive, and we've always thought in that direction that we are going to remain labor intensive. Whereas, a lot of places automation is required, and, we have to start thinking along the lines of digitization and also automation. And, personally, from an organization standpoint, I think this thought process was what was, stopping us initially to sort of go for that, achievement in terms of growing beyond a certain point. And I think right now we're looking at a lot of things in terms of automation. We're looking at R&D, which typically, MSMEs do not focus on, and essentially do not. And because of, and it's a complete what, everybody said, it's because of the ecosystem that they're focusing on. It's because generally MSMEs are over leveraged, and we were also over leveraged. Lack of, financials from NBFCs, from banks, not looking at order book values, but typically looking just at the balance sheets, and not looking at what the future could hold, and then financing those order values basically. And that, becomes, and typically MSMEs would not require long-term financial help. They would always require stopgap financial help. And that is something that banks are not willing to do, because they're looking at, long-term working capital requirement and things like that. But most MSMEs, and if you look at, if you're talking about the global markets, you're typically serving them in holiday seasons, and most MSMEs would require funding along those lines. And that itself becomes a challenge, because NBFCs and banks do not understand that stopgap funding, which is required for MSMEs. So, typically what happens is that we, at the beginning of our journey, over leverage ourselves, and then we are stuck in that ecosystem of that niche that we're operating. Because if you look at it, there are two ecosystems we can operate in, and this is what we've understood. We could be OEMs for bigger brands, and that's what we've been doing for a large part of our journey. Eventually, if we want to grow beyond a point, we want to start thinking like a brand also. And fortunately for us, we've been able to make that transition in certain countries which are critical for our growth, like the US market. So, I would say that, all the things that our esteemed, panelists have mentioned, they combine, they form these challenges for MSMEs to grow beyond a certain point. So, everything from the ecosystem problem, from the financial problem, from quality and efficiency, because we've been stuck in that thought process of being labor intensive. So we've not sort of, gone ahead and done research and development and automation, because if everything is labor intensive, then, and we're not even training the labor. We're not even increasing on the skill part of the labor. Right? So all those things combined are the challenges that SMEs, including ourselves, we face.
So Arora, if I can come to you, and picking up from where Pranav mentioned that, capital requirements for MSMEs generally tend to be seasonal in nature and maybe short-term in nature. Have banks and, lending institutions understood that? Have they tailored their products in such a way?
Well, clearly, as Pranav says, not as much as they should, in my mind. Now, I think there are two things around that. One is, it's about the fact that you need to start setting very different underwriting standards as you look at the micro SMEs and the need for micro SMEs. The way you look at and the criteria that you define the creditworthiness has to be looked at very differently. To Pranav's point, I think we've also got to look at that banks operate under a certain element of credit, risk appetite, as well as balance sheet pressure, because they've got to generate that return on that balance sheet, right? Now, if you start looking at purely from a financial parameters point of view, which is typically the way we look at these things, you will find that actually it makes it very difficult to make any of the micro SMEs creditworthy. The alternate to that is to start bringing in a lot more parameters, which are growth parameters for the micro SMEs, and enabling that to be a criteria. So not making it purely dependent upon the past history, but also keeping a huge perspective on the forward-looking journey of the micro SMEs. In addition, there's a lot of data points that, thanks to some of the digital play that's happening in India, that now is becoming available in terms of social fabric, ecosystem level data, Because, for example, if it's a small SME, but delivering as an OEM to a very large brand and has a track record of delivering to that brand, that track record itself is a good criteria to see the nature of the SME, the sensitivity, and the linkages to that brand. And that should also define the creditworthiness of the micro SME. Now, the banks are starting to do that in terms of supply chain financing, because they're looking to bring supply chains into the financing arena by making a play of the ecosystem. But there's a lot more to be done there now.
Right. Sai, if I can come to you, one way to be competitive is to play to our strengths. So what are India's strengths?
No, I think when we are talking about the Indian SMEs, the strength lies in flexibility in the operation. They can quickly change gear, they can adapt to the new and challenging circumstances, which they have done it also. Except for few countries, we also have the wage advantage. Of course, there are countries in South Asia who may be having wage advantage much more than what we have. But I personally feel again that we are talking about the SMEs. Let us look into the market dynamics in which SMEs have to work. We are not talking about a socialist system where banks or everyone will give preference to that unless it is backed by a government scheme. The irony of the matter is that when exports are not doing well, a particular sector is not doing well, when they are approaching the bank for help, it's a matter of crisis for them. The top management of the bank gives the instruction that you have to be little careful in dealing with the sector. The sector is not doing well. So it's a very difficult situation when you're talking from the perspective of the SME. But my personal view is that we should look into the SMEs from the point of view of developing a hub and spoke model. We require large companies to come in, and then these SMEs can work as ancillaries. We have done that in case of automobile. When Maruti Suzuki came, we saw a number of SMEs which developed in the Gurgaon region initially, and then we have seen some of them coming into the Manesar region. With the kind of technology which has been provided, they have developed India as a base for auto component. Today is one of the major players in auto component because technology was there. We were adhering to the international benchmark. We were competitive. So I personally feel that the kind of a scheme which has been rolled by the government, for example, the production link incentive, particularly in the sunrise sectors, maybe it electronics, mobile sector, machinery, this will help a lot for two reasons. One is that all these schemes have a clause of local content. So meet the clause of local content. These companies, even if they are the overseas company, will be much interested to procure from the domestic sources to meet the local requirement norms. And they also have to adhere to the value addition. So there is enough opportunity which will come for the SMEs there. I personally feel that let us not look into SMEs competing with the best in the world, which is not possible. Let us look into the strength which they have and try to leverage that strength to the best of the country's game.
Right. Mr. Saxena, if you can come to, one of the reasons why firms stay small or micro in India, people say is that, is also because of the nature of the laws that we have in place. It encourages firms and companies to stay small. How much of that is relevant now? And do you think the changed definition of MSME will make a material difference?
Still, it is relevant. And the laws and the frame, whatever laws have been framed and in the government policies, they probably support you to remain small. Because what is happening, in a small MSME has been, called a favorite word with the government. Everyone is talking about MSME, and a lot of promotional schemes like public procurement. 25% of the PSU is reserved for that. All these things, they force you to remain in micro and small. What is happening? If you see out of the 6.6 crore, which are the registered units, the medium is around 1,000 units. That's all in our country. What is happening? There is no voice, no special platform for the medium enterprises in India. The moment you become medium, you are neither getting the advantage of the small, micro. Second, you are competing with the large corporates. And you cannot compete with the large corporates, the kind of financial muscle power they have, the kind of, all the legal framework is the same for medium and large. So it becomes very, very difficult for them to survive in the large ecosystem. They get priced out, they get from all the major contracts, and their cartelization by the large corporates in certain sectors. So it always forces you to struggle a lot in the medium enterprises. And that's the reason. And as one of the participants said, majority of the micro and small are the proprietorship concerns. So they probably want to remain in that area where they have 100% control on their enterprise and take advantage of the certain provisions of the MSME where they get a share in the public procurement. Plus the payment, you see the 45 days payment is only for the small and micro, not for the medium. So all these advantages, basically they become disadvantage for a medium enterprise to grow from there. And that's why this mindset of remain dwarf is happening. And it need to be, government and probably the industry chambers. You see the industry chambers also, the people who advocate the policy. They are either the FICCI, CII kind of SHM. We always controlled and talk about the large corporates. They work for their interests. And either like FISME like us, where we speak about micro and small. So there is a vacuum and there is no space for medium to take up their issues with the government. So these are probably the factors where this phenomena is still, we are not seeing much change in that.
So Pranav, did you ever think that, why did my organization grow? Given the number of regulations and laws that you need to adhere to, do you think that, it was better off if you remain micro or small maybe?
So I mean, that's, something that I wanted to comment and respectfully sort of disagree with Mr. Sahai. We no longer want to be ancillary, sir. We do not want to continue to be ancillaries to bigger companies. You're absolutely right. We do not have the muscle power to compete, but unless and until we have the aspiration, we'll never have the muscle power. So I think today, to answer your question, Pran, it's a matter of thought process again. So as I said that, unless and until today, if I have ordered one automation machine from, like, let's say AI, a Swedish company which is a robot manufacturer, I have a thought process. I have an aspiration. I do not have an assembly line, but I have an aspiration to become no longer an ancillary to, of course, that may in the short term provide growth for me and may provide my factory to grow from that aspect. But there's a brand aspiration also around what we do as well. So for us, it's a slightly different, I would say, a thought process, because we also have a brand aspect related to what we do. Secondly, to add to Mr. Animesh's, Mr. Saxena's point, absolutely, he's absolutely correct. And, one of the few things which we've heard in the past 5 to 7 years is regularly we keep getting equity investment offers, which sort of have a thought process of a promoter exit at the end of it, and which is something that we're not looking at, right? So, we want to grow from a small MSME to a medium industry, and then grow onto a bigger company, but not with the thought process that the promoter exit happens while doing that. And that typically happens to a lot of companies, is that there is investment available from private equity side, but that investment is typically from a thought process of making an exit for the private equities as well as the promoters. So those few things are something which is a thought process matter, and I firmly believe that until and unless we have by nature and by and large for a majority of the time that we've been doing business outside of India, barring Indian market, we've primarily been an OEM supplier to the bigger companies, and we have been ancillaries, as sir rightly said. And I think for us, that thought process has changed now largely, and we do not want to continue to remain ancillaries. We want to compete, and we are competing with the much bigger companies in established markets like the US market. But in order to do that, all the other factors still stand. Financing still stands, automation still stands, the ecosystem needs still stands. So, despite all of those things, I think it's the thought process that now that we have taken that is allowing us to take that step. Because 5 years back, if you'd asked me that would I launch my own brand in the US market, I would have said that, probably not, because the nitty-gritties of it, were too big to handle. Right now we're supplying directly to Costco. and Costco requires a WHO GMP audit, a COC audit, multiple audits which typically 5 years ago my factory couldn't have passed. But during those 5 years, we had a thought process change, and we made sure that now specifically in the last 1 year and a half, specifically during the time of the pandemic, when we had these orders come in, we made sure that the factory evolved, and that evolution now has brought us to a point where we think that we no longer want to be just ancillaries.
So, Pranav, I think when I refer to the ancillary, it doesn't mean that if you start an ancillary, you have to be ancillary throughout your existence. Look at Sona Steering. They started ancillary of Maruti. Today, they are the world leader in steering, and they are supplying to all the companies in the world. And probably your example is also the same. So I don't think there should be any hesitancy.
No, absolutely.
But then you should have the aspiration to become a big also.
Correct.
Right. So Arora, we'll leave the ancillary part away. But if you look at the auto sector, that's an area of example where our SMEs seems to have done well. Maybe they started off with bigger companies, but now they have found their footing in the global world. Can the success of the auto sector be replicated somewhere else, or have we passed that era of 1990s and 1980s where something like this would have worked? And what are your thoughts on this?
So that's a very interesting comparison to make, Pranav. And I'm a firm believer that you keep learning and keep evolving from the good things that have been done. And auto industry is really an example of something that was done, which has made it big in India and put it on the world stage to a large extent. India today is the largest auto industry in the world, right? Production of 25.3 million vehicles as compared to a US of 17.5 million and a Euro of 12.6 million. It by far surpasses a lot of the erstwhile large auto economies to a large extent. What's helped grow that? I think it's been referred here in the discussion by the panelists. The first was the liberalization and bringing some of the larger players to actually start the domestic production in India. What that did was it expanded the ecosystem and actually enabled a lot of the fragmented component, small-time auto manufacturers, auto component manufacturers, and made that into more of a organized sector, because they were starting to now from very fragmented cottage industries get into more organized sector, because they were starting to become ancillary or OEM providers to some of the large brand names. What that brought was an awareness of the quality that's required, adaptation to the new technology that's required, and finally, they could actually set the aspiration that Pranav mentions of growth for their own companies to a large extent. In addition, because it was becoming quite an organized sector, the access to financing to actually help that growth was starting to seep in, because everybody saw that this is becoming an industry that everybody wants a piece of. So financing was really becoming more readily available. I think second was favorable policies, and you can't discount that, right? So whether it was the automobile training institutes that were set up, design centers, auto parks, SEZs, export promotion capital goods, duty remittance, mercantile export from India's schemes, all of that policies were actually favoring the setup of this cottage industry becoming a real organized industry and helping the micro SMEs to grow with that industry as the growth sets in to a large extent. So I think there were these three elements to it. One, the growth of the ecosystem, because we are starting to get access to the latest technology, policy changes, and it becoming an organized sector where you could actually look at that. There is an absolute replication of that that's possible in the sunrise industry that we're looking at. I think if you really give Make in India a serious push and actually get the international brands to come in, and they start developing similar ecosystems as we develop, you start getting access to similar technology, similar learnings around the technology, and a skill set that's getting acquired by the workforce, you could replicate this industry by industry. So is there a replication opportunity? There absolutely is one.
Mrs. Saxena, how
Yeah.
much of this, the technological changes, technology for renovation, how much of that is already happening in the MSME sector, and have the participants of the sector understood that the importance of technology at the moment?
You see, this is very clear that most of the majority of the MSME, they have understood the importance of that infusion of the new technology and new skill sets. And to that direction, something very interesting has started happening. Like I give you the example of the Korea, South Korea, and Taiwan. These two countries have an excellent, robust SME sector there in technology. Unfortunately, their markets are saturated, so they are looking to go out. But the problem is with their size, SME, they find it, especially come in India and set up on their own, very, very difficult. Because the ease of doing business, whatever we say, it is still not easy. The regulatory mechanism and the bureaucracy. So they are looking for some local partnerships where they bring their technology, they bring the skill set, and the Indian partner has all the regulations, he has the land, he has the space to set up that, and a collaboration between two. So this has started. The government is also serious on that, and as a FISME, we signed an MOU with the South Korea, their SME association, to some sort of a matchmaking where we are bringing the SMEs who want to set up shop here in India and looking for a right partner for them. And same way in Taiwan, we are discussing with the Taiwan also. They also have, especially in the solar technology and the electrical vehicle. This is going to be a huge opportunity for India. So there are a lot of things which can support an electric vehicle. This technology is available there. So absolutely, this is the only way that Indian MSME can remain competitive and grow. And I'll come back to one old point which you were talking about, the medium, and which Pranav also said. You know what happens? We also realize that the medium enterprises. We started a new initiative called FAME as a forum for aspiring medium enterprises. People like Pranav, where they are aspiring, we'll provide them a platform to discuss the issues. First, the cross-cutting issues of every industry, like either it's a food or a technology or chemical. There are some cross-cutting issues, which we take up to the relevant authorities, the state or the central government. And then there are sector-specific issues. So, and we know, the only prospect for India to provide jobs is the medium enterprises. Large are not creating any jobs. They are going for automation. Small are happy within their own size. So they are also not adding new jobs. It's only the medium enterprises which has the maximum potential and which is the need of today's countries. Our need is the jobs. So these two things which we are trying to do, bringing the technology and matchmaking and giving a space to the medium enterprises.
Pranav, if I could just add to that point, to Mr. Saxena, I think the question really, Mr. Saxena, is how do you actually get more into that medium bucket?
Yeah.
Because if you really want to generate a lot of employment, we are right, absolutely right. And that's the only way it's going to come. And they're going to become a bigger contributor to the GDP. Yeah. And the question is, how do you transition a large chunk of these smaller micro SMEs who are sitting, create that platform of aspiration for them, create that platform of technology for them, create that platform of ecosystem widening for them to really move them up. And Pran, to your last bit of your question, I think 2021 is very different from 1990, right? There is a huge amount of technology proliferation, but at the same time, the cost of technology has come down. Right? So what you could see to be quite expensive in 1990 is not expensive yet. There's also concepts of Uberization of technology, right? And shared assets. So being able to provide that shared technology assets could actually help the larger micro SMEs to adopt them because they don't now need to actually put the cost of owning the asset, which was very prohibitive, but they can actually go into shared assets. I think that is going to be the big change as we go forward.
Interesting. Mr. Sahai, if you have to state three qualities or three attributes, what would those be to to be successful in the international market?
I think the three attributes, the one attribute has to be competitive. You have to be competitive to stay in the market, because in globalization, whether it's the movement of goods or the movement of services, it's towards the person who is the most competitive in production. And when I'm talking about the prices, I'm taking both prices and quality together. And the second factor, I think, which we need to build is the branding of the product. Unfortunately, in our export, there is no branding happening. Of course, we are exporting a lot of brand, but we are simply doing a job work for the brand. Unfortunately, none of the Indian SMEs having their own brand. Very few are having the brand, because the cost of developing a brand is prohibitive. We always tell the government that there has to be branding of country, there has to be branding of a particular product as a whole, and then there has to be branding by the companies also. So we have to move in all these three segments, which is extremely important for us. And finally, I think we have to provide an element of certainty. There's a lot of unpredictability which is going on when somebody is procuring or sourcing the goods from SMEs. That needs to be changed. And I think one of the reasons for that has been the supply side challenges, which has been there for pretty long time. The good news is that government is spending a lot in now infrastructure, which will be definitely be improving the logistics to a large extent. Some of the taxation changes has also helped. We have GST, which has made the country really a single country for taxation point of view. We have now e-way bill coming in, and if that is also joined with the electronic plaza, we will have Indian trucks, which will now be covering around 700 to 800 kilometers a day, which is well close to the international benchmark. All this will help a lot to India. We should bear in mind that logistics cost in India is one of the highest in the world. And this logistics cost affect both your production cost as well as the transportation cost. Many studies have revealed that India's manufacturing cost is one of the lowest in the world so far as manufacturing within the factory is concerned. We are outpriced by the factors which are outside the factory. So if we are addressing those factors, I think that will be a game changer for the SME.
On the point of certainty, Dr. Sahai, but sometimes the laws also change. One year you are allowed to export, then an order comes in says that this year you cannot export. Case in point, sugar, if you can take. That also brings in a certain element of confusion, right?
No, I entirely agree with you. In agriculture sector, you have to deal little differently. A better policy would have been that you know what is your stock. You also do a small projection of your anticipated crop and accordingly decide it. What has happened recently is that government has taken a call that in no cases they will be restricting the organic products of export. So assuming even the potato is not allowed for export, organic potatoes will be allowed. Secondly, they have said that just to push the value addition, that if you are sending something in the consumer packs, so even let us say rice export is banned, rice in consumer pack of 5 kg would be allowed. To some extent, they have definitely addressed that. We are of the view that government should allow free exports and free imports of the product. Even if you have shortage of the product, allow exports, because it's very difficult to develop a market. And if you are not in the market even for 1 year, when the particular importing country requires your product, you are totally out of the market. So in that situation, you can import the product. So from the Federation point of view, we are for the free export, and if the need be, we can allow the duty-free imports to meet the domestic requirement.
So, Pranav, if I can come to you operate in a sector where there is immense competition. You make table tennis equipment primarily, and that's one sector where there's stiff competition from China. How did you, go about tackling that competition? If you can share with us briefly.
I mean, one of the advantages and disadvantages I would say is that we operate in a sector where we are primarily only competing with China. So what that does is that we are outside of China. We're a very niche company in terms of our production capacities, and in terms of outside of China, we're probably the biggest manufacturers, of table tennis products in Asia. There are other companies in Germany and in Spain which produce, and in France which produce good amount of quantities. But outside of China, we're the only other country which is producing goods at a certain capacity. So that has been helpful. I mean, obviously there has been a sort of like an anti-China movement which has been going on globally and specifically in the US, and that particularly has helped us in the last 2 years during the pandemic. And that, coupled with the fact that indoor sports as a category grew quite a bit with work from home being a mandate in developed economies, especially in US and in Europe. So both these things together sort of meant that we were able to establish ourselves in those markets. Having said that, if you talk about, and what Mr. Sahai mentioned, and what Mr. Saxena also mentioned, basically for us, the cost of manufacturing within the factory is something that we can actually compete with China. But when you talk about freight specifically, and other supply chain issues within revolving around that freight aspect of it.
You're based at Meerut, right?
Based out of Meerut, right? So we are about 1,500 kilometers away from a port. That means that automatically we're about 10% more expensive when the goods reach the port. So that typically hampers the costing aspect of it. Having said that, what we did do during these 2 years is that we sort of pivoted to an extent where we were earlier manufacturing and competing on the price points and manufacturing the lower end of the goods, and then we moved to the fact that we're no longer going to be supplying the lower end of the tables, but we'll move to the higher end of the category. And then that helped us quite a bit, because what that meant is that we started competing actually with the German and the French and the Spanish manufacturers on the quality side with a cheaper price point. So suddenly, from being more expensive from the Chinese counterparts, we actually became a cheaper alternative for quality products for the Spanish and the French and the German manufacturers. Coincidentally, during these 2 years, one of those manufacturers went bankrupt, which also meant a lot of their manufacturing came to us. So, those things allowed us to pivot outside that criteria of always trying to provide the cheapest product. We changed that mindset and we said we're no longer going to provide the cheapest product, but we're going to provide a good quality product at a very good value.
Interesting. Mr. Arora, no longer needed to compete with China if you have to on the price point.
I think that's a very interesting concept. So we know that I think it's now a reality that there is going to be a China plus one strategy that everybody's starting to follow, right? And that's because what this pandemic, as well as what's happened between the US-China equation has proven, is that you got to diversify your procurement base, and it all can't be China. So no longer China can only be the producer of the world. You got to have other producers where you can diversify. And the diversification of risk is taking place, which is what is called as the China plus one strategy. Within that, you will certainly see that the diversification or disruption, as it's called, supply chains, is beginning to happen. And that's moving into the Asian markets. India is going to be a big beneficiary of that, provided, to Pranav's point, if the SMEs decide to really take advantage of that chain by making sure that they pivot their mindset and aspiration to quality, to technology, and to being able to produce products which actually can compete internationally, I think there's a huge advantage for India. I mean, there's another example. I mean, one of the biggest beneficiaries of this China plus one is Vietnam. And again, Vietnam, because they immediately pivoted towards making sure that they become the next semiconductor producers of the world, right? To a large extent, post-Taiwan, to a large extent. So I think there's a huge manufacturing opportunity in India, given the quality of the labor that we have, the abundance of the labor we have. If we can actually take technology and set our minds on producing good quality products that can compete internationally, I think there's a huge opportunity for the clients, for the manufacturing base out of India. And one of the things we are looking at really supporting is the micro SMEs. And one of the ventures from SC Ventures or Standard Chartered Bank that we've launched in India is called Solv. Solv is predominantly a platform that's actually able to bring micro SMEs and give them a huge advantage in terms of financial and digital inclusion.
The next time, Pranav, you need funding, you know whom to approach.
Definitely.
you and I should certainly touch base offline on this.
We'll have a separate conversation, definitely, sir.
And Stag is a great brand.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. And just to add to Mr. Arora's point and also to Mr. Saxena's point, what he had earlier mentioned, I think one of the things which we realized is that it's not just important to initially, I mean, obviously when this China plus one policy was being formulated and, buyers actively were looking for producers outside of China. One thing which happened is a lot of Chinese companies also went into Vietnam and set up shop. So that was one competition that we were facing from there. The second thing, as we said, that we pivoted to quality. But when we say we pivoted to quality, we actually come back to Mr. Saxena's point, and getting the orders is just the first step, right? So post that, the efficiency, and we no longer can act like a SME. You no longer can behave like one. You have to act like a proper manufacturer when you are starting to deal with the bigger clients. So shipping windows are critical. Efficiency in terms of making sure that what product you've initially displayed is what you've offered and what gets delivered is critical. And initially you are going to face teething problems with that. But then how quickly do you deal with those problems? How quickly are you able to test a market? How quickly are you able to, you have an online trial with the seller, and then suddenly you have a in-store nationwide rollout. Are you able to adapt yourself to deliver those kind of quality products that you're promising? Because it's one thing to say that I'm going to deliver quality, and there is another promise which is attached to it, that I'm going to do it when I do the production runs. And that is something which is very critical. And that's what we spent nights, and we discussed this in the ET article, Pran, that we spend nights on quality checks, right? So both me and my father, we were going into the factory late at night, making sure that checking, sample products, making sure that we're delivering those qualities. We made sure that we deliver all the products as per the, even with the challenges with transportation, logistics globally was hugely affected. We had, COVID was one, Suez Canal was another impact, which impacted all our containers. But we made sure that we ship from our factory, at least, on the shipping windows that were given to us. So those things we no longer can behave. Once we've taken that decision and aspiration is there to grow, we no longer can behave as SME. We have to behave as if we are an established organization, and we have to deliver basically on those points.
Mr. Saxena?
I'd like to add on what Pranav said.
Please. Yes.
When he said his father used to go in the night and check this, why they need to go there? This is the difference.
Initially, and now we put things in place, and you're absolutely right.
You have to produce right first time. And this is the difference. Unless we reach to that level where a Japanese SME or a Taiwanese SMEs, whatever they produce, their operator on the machine is right at the first time. There is no checking point. Checking is a waste. If you go by a Japanese technology of 5S, checking is a waste. You are adding a cost to your production because you are checking a product. So something like this. This is the mindset. Why the auto sector, which Mr. Arora said, succeeded. When these companies came, especially Maruti Suzuki, they created a tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 supplier. And they did the hand holding. They took them to Japan, showed them how that manufacturer is working, and they introduced each and every system, even the system how you go and sit in your canteen and eat your food. Even to that extent, they trained the people. And they have a very stringent rating, which they follow even the Sona steering till now. It's a red, green, and categories. And they keep on evaluating and monitoring you. The moment you slip, your orders are stopped or your orders are reduced. So unless that is done, the quality has to come in our DNA.
Absolutely, sir. And that was the starting point. And
that is the starting point.
Nobody was hand-holding us. So initially we had to hand-hold.
Yes.
And but now, I mean, and to your point, sir, I'm sorry I'm interrupting, but to your point, post the WHO GMP, post the COC audits, post making all those changes within our factory, now everything is automated to that extent where we no longer need to spend those nights. But initial that you said that somebody had to go to Japan, go through the processes, we had to do that with our family, with our workers, with everybody, to make sure that that initial step has been taken by somebody. Unfortunately, fortunately, we did not have anybody taking us to Japan for that matter, and we had to rely on our experience.
Wonderful. Mr. Sahai, if I can come to you, the buzzword nowadays is, technology-based R&D products like electronics, IT hardware, telecom equipment. How can we increase our presence in such areas?
I think we have to focus on that segment where major global trade is happening. The fact is that if you look into electrical, electronics, machinery, and automobile, they put together account for roughly 35% of the global trade. In this entire segment, India's share, except for the automobile sector where we have 2%, is less than 0.5%. Our electronics bill import alone is close to $100 billion. So there is an urgent need to develop domestic capabilities. Unfortunately, in electronics, India signed ITA-1. With the result, we have not allowed Indian companies to thrive in because imports was allowed at zero duty. We have also not linked our tariff policy with the FDI policy. If you look into the China, the segment where they wanted to attract FDI, they always kept the tariff very high so that if somebody has to sell to China, he has to come and invest in China through the FDI mode. Unfortunately, we have lost at that point of time. But now we are seeing that clearly in the electronics sector, government has raised the tariff. Government is attracting investment through the PLI scheme. I personally feel that the tariff which has been extended are for the limited period. I'm of the view to provide some protection to investor to have the scalability, but once he achieves the scalability, you have to bring down the tariff. Otherwise, it creeps in the inefficiency into the system. There is huge market which is waiting for that. All that is required is to have large player, maybe the Indian large player. Now we have Indian companies also who are talking about the $1 billion investment. So it's not necessary it has to come through the FDI route. It can be domestic investment, it can be foreign investment. But we have to bear in mind that there are countries who are also providing huge support to the investor. The advantage to India is definitely a huge market, but then you have to compete to seek the investment. Our plea with the government has been to try to attract the investment from those countries who have already invested in India, because then the companies can also talk about the success stories in those countries. For example, if you're talking about China, Japan, you're talking about South Korea, it is much easier to attract investment rather than from a countries in Latin America or somewhere else. So once we start investing into these sectors, I'm pretty sure over a period of time, these companies who are investing in India will try to build a domestic base. And when they achieve the scalability, they will also be adding to your export base. So we need to attract the investment, A, with a view to reduce the import dependence, and B, to build the production base to look into the export. Because unless we enter into these segments, it is very difficult for India to move from, let us say, current export of goods and services together of around $500 billion to $1,000 billion. Because it's not possible that just based on the strength of the employment intensive sector, you increase your export by $500 billion. For doing so, you have to move towards the sunrise sectors of exports.
So, Arora, we've kept talking about, moving up the technology ladder. But hey, we are in a situation where, most of the small businesses are struggling to survive because of the pandemic. Do you think in a situation like this, investment into technology and changing the way you operate, that's possible?
Sometimes I think you will find that situations like this are actually pandemics like COVID are sometimes the spur that kind of thinking, right? Because they say necessity is the mother of invention, right, to a large extent. So what we found is that micro SMEs have certainly improved their receptivity to technology to a large extent. And let me give you an example. We deal with a large chunk of Kirana stores, okay? If the Kirana stores in lockdown situations were only allowed to operate 4 hours, what they immediately did was that they actually made digital shop fronts, right? Small websites, digital shop fronts, so that the neighborhood could offer through that, and they could actually make sure that they get aggregated demand and supply, right? So in small ways, there is the adoption of technology that's seeping into the micro SMEs as things are looking at, and the pandemic has actually been an impetus to that seeping to happen. Now, I don't think that's enough, okay? The reason I don't say that that's enough is because to what everybody said, I think the focus now has to be to make sure that you're actually using the technology and the new ways that the world is operating to be able to create your businesses and scale them up to the next level. For that, they do need support. Where do they need support? They need fiscal policy support. They need support in terms of cushioning the period that they've gone through so that that investment can be made. But they also need support that you can actually get a lot of these capabilities done in forms of service. I think the fintech infrastructure in India is booming. And to a large extent, all of the services which were generally available to only the large corporates can now be packaged into something that can be made available to the smaller businesses by offering them a service and not cost of ownership. The more we can start offering that, as I said, Uberization of these services in terms of shared ownership, so you're not really having to incur the cost, but you can take advantage of that, that is going to spur the adoption of technology with the micro SMEs.
Mr. Saxena, if I can come to you, one aspect that we haven't talked about is the role of intellectual property in fueling competitiveness. How do we strengthen that within the sector in India?
That's a serious issue, and it goes against most of our, businesses. And this is, in fact, the government was trying hard, but unfortunately, this sector was so fragmented and I'll call it unregulated, that these things, a lot of violations were happening. But now I think there has to be some serious effort, especially if it can be driven through the industrial associations. Most of the MSME also operate in a cluster form. Certain cities have a certain kind of industries, and there are industrial clusters like this. And the government has to join hands with probably the industrial associations to start enforcing this and explaining them the advantage of this. Plus, there has to be a lot of that Mr. Arora said, because most of the MSMEs, especially micro, they are left on their own. For them, survival is the prime, part. So they never care for all these issues. So if some sort of, support system can be created for them, and then they move towards this, because this is the future. If you don't do that, you will probably not be growing. And that is also one of the reasons micro is not growing, because the moment they grow beyond this, they cannot do these violations. So I think a support system is required, where they are assured of, probably an awareness of the new technology. You see, in our country, in the last 50, 60 years, there were a lot of industrial development centers, district industry center side of things. They are typically a government organization, completely defunct. They're not doing anything on that side. So some technology support, and as he said, Mr. Arora, that the financial part. Banks are reluctant to fund the micro and small enterprises because they have a very straight-jacketed norms for lending you, a very, very, SMA database and balance sheets. They have to be flexible, and fintech will be a game changer, which we also feel now. The fintech is going to be a game changer now. With these things, I think India will probably, all these, especially these micro and small units, they'll have to come into the ambit of this industrial, intellectual property regulations. We cannot afford to violate that and not to follow that.
Right. Mr. Arora?
If I could just ask Mr. Saxena and Sahai for the view, and probably I'm going to take your role over for a minute by planting a question.
Yes, please.
Is there a way we could actually incentivize the micro SMEs to start innovating for the long term, start building for the long term, going down the path of actually establishing real strong character for quality products, building brands, instead of the typical jugaad mode of survival? And I think that, in my mind, is going to be the way. I have seen that the reason why you find South Korea, China, or a couple of markets have actually developed brands is because their incentivization process worked that way. Our incentivization as of now is SME incentivization, mid-corporate incentivization. Should we move that to incentivizing people like Stag, who are actually taking a much more longer-term view on these things?
Yes. Yes. You see, there was a last 2, 3 years, a lot of efforts by this Quality Council of India, like some rating. But what end of the day, if you are, suppose you start following and hand holding by them, and you qualify to become a gold or silver categorized, but what is there for you in that? What do you get? So it has to be incentivized. Like in the government procurement, you see, we all know what kind of quality is supplied to the government. We have been following the L1 methodology, and that has corrupted the quality culture in our in our country. If you become a government supplier, I am 100% sure you cannot go to the private market and supply, because the whole culture in your organization gets corrupted, because you are producing substandard product to supply to your one of the bigger client. And the same culture you cannot change overnight, that today I'm producing for A is a bad quality and tomorrow I have to ship to B, which has to be international quality. It will not happen. So it has to be incentivized.
So China is doing that successfully. They are supplying the inferior quality to the world. They are supplying the best quality.
Yes, they've managed to do that when it comes to their vaccines also.
Yes. So we have to incentivize, and the government, government and all together, state, central, and PSUs, they are the biggest business entity in our country. If they don't improve their buying practices, if they don't improve their quality standards, the things will not change easily in our country. So a change has to come from the top.
So running completely out of time. So last question to all of you will remain the same. Starting with you, Pranav, because you're smiling the most, that, what has been the impact of COVID on your business? And what do you think, will be the impact on how competitive or, your outlook for your industry?
As far as the impact of COVID, for us as a business, and I'm going to strictly talk about Stag as a business, it has been positive, right? Of course, a lot of impacts a lot of lives have been impacted, and that's the sad part and very sad part of it. And if we could take things back, we would not want it to happen. But from a business standpoint, what has happened is that work from home has become a norm in the international markets. A large diaspora of work from home in the international market, specifically in the US, are basically Indians who are working in the IT industry, who have typically studied in the Indian market, know Stag as a brand from India, and are now, basically looking at playing table tennis or any indoor sport at home. And that leverage and that natural extension has been, come across. So if you look at Costco and people reviewing on Costco.com, which even Costco didn't expect, people are going in there and saying, oh, we've used to play on Stag as a kid. And a lot of the Indian diaspora in the international market is buying. And that is what is fueling growth for us in the US market. And, we feel that that is helping us establish Stag as a brand in the US market. So for us, the impact of COVID has been that, work from home has become a normal mandate, even with economies opening up. And that essentially has meant that people are now looking at activities at home, fitness activities at home, and indoor sports for both fitness as well as leisure, and both those things play right into an indoor sport like table tennis, basically.
Right, Dr. Sahai.
In fact, I think so far as MSMEs are concerned, COVID has definitely dried up their liquidity. They were not in the business, but they were settled with the fixed assets and other things. They were paying for the wages. Unfortunately, those who were not having the bank credit have been affected, because even the ECLGS scheme, they have been deprived of the benefit, as they have no outstanding as on 29th of February 2020. Government should realize that they require the credit just because of the wave 1 and the wave 2. Before that, they have pulled up their own resources, and that kind of support needs to be given. But generally, SMEs have also realized the importance of digitization. The kind of digitization which they have done in last 10 months or so is something which they would not have done in the last 10 years. So they are positive of the COVID also on that. But I think liquidity needs to be looked into for the SMEs as a whole.
Mrs. Saxena?
Mrs. Sahai rightly said the liquidity was the biggest challenge. In fact, the second wave for this large number of micro and small, it has been devastating. I don't know, any entrepreneur or his family which was not directly impacted by this. So, and 80% of, micro don't have institutional credit access. So for them, it has been really, really tough. The payments are delayed. Even whatever little they could supply, the payments were not made on time. The supply chain was disrupted. And you have seen the cost of raw material, which has gone up, almost all the raw material. So they are in a very, very bad shape. In fact, if you look at the businesses, except the certain sectors where they were benefited by this lockdowns or work from home, majority of the sector, they are down by almost 30 to 40% in their turnover. And it will take them next 2 years. If no further waves come, it will take them 2 years to come back to the pre-corona times. So this is a tough time, and government has to come up with certain scheme which can take care of their fixed expenses, which are the salaries, rentals, and all these costs, which they had no institutional finance support. So this will be a major challenge for the government. Let's hope no further wave comes and we try to recover. And digital, which he said, the digital transformation has been good. And last 10 months, people have learned how to operate remotely, when you are physically not present at your business. Most of our working was, people-centric. But now I think we are learning to be a process-centric work. So it's an opportunity also, but the things are difficult, not easy for the MSME right now.
Right. Mr. Arora, I will let you have the last word.
Thank you. And I'll try and keep it short given the paucity of time. So I agree with everything that's been said. COVID-19, unprecedented crisis has hit the world in various forms in terms of economic liquidity. And it's really hit the micro SMEs the most because they are at the vulnerable end of the food chain to a large extent, right? So, but there is silver lining. And I'm generally a glass half full guy. So there is silver lining. The silver lining in my mind is three things. One, the supply chain disruption. And the supply chain disruption is here to stay. That diversification of supply chain will happen. And I do find that the emerging markets, which could become the next manufacturing hubs of the world, India being absolutely the center of that, is going to be beneficial in the long run. It's for the government, the policy setters, and the micro SMEs to take advantage of that, but that advantage stays. Second, I also think it's been a real inflection point for the micro SMEs to really adopt and adapt to technology, which will serve them very well in the long run, because it's not going to go away. Once you adopt it, you become native. And once you become native, it becomes a way of doing business going forward. I think that change is absolutely critical and significant for the future of micro SMEs. Within that, I still find that there is going to be, for the next 12 to 18 months, a huge amount of support provided for them to tie through that to really become the micro SMEs or the SMEs of the future. Now, I can tell you, within a small venture that we've done, Solv, we had to support these making sure that the supply chains work, especially for the essential goods. So our warehouses had to be opened at 2 a.m. so that they can actually meet the cutoffs in each city. But that was an important pivot. So if we can all pivot and make sure that we actually get ready for what this has taught us, I'm a firm believer that there is a better outcome for the micro SMEs as long as we can handle them in the next 12 to 18 months.
A better outcome. That sounds positive, and I certainly hope that we carry on the path of digital adoption. I think that is one of the ways which we can up our competitiveness quotient. I think this has been a fantastic discussion and absolutely fascinating. Before we leave for the day, I would like to thank our sponsors for this, the Cell Global partner, which is eBay, banking partner, Deutsche Bank, partners, our state partner, MIDC, and assessment partner, their advisory for helping us put this thing together. Again, to my panel members, thank you so much for being a part of this. This was really insightful and, like I said, a fascinating discussion. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.